What's up, everybody? It's Chris Sims here from ComicsAlliance.com, and this is Here's the Thing. And for this week's episode, we've got another question from a viewer. Do we have that, Jocelyn? Oh, thank you very much. This one comes from Stalwart1000 on Twitter, who would like to know, why has the thought bubble gone extinct in modern superhero comics when it's such a great tool for characterization? Thought bubble, huh? Oh, sorry. Nothing there. Forgot for a second that we were in the modern age. If this was 1973, you would have seen all kinds of stuff going on around my head. But unfortunately, we don't really use thought bubbles anymore. And I don't know why, because I like them a lot. I like all that stuff that's part of the sort of unique visual language of comics. See, words and pictures go together really well. They're the easiest way to tell information. That's the whole Scott McCloud theory, right? That words and pictures, they get them instantly. But with comics, the stories are so complex, especially when you throw in superpowers and all the dramatic stuff that's going on, that they have to develop unique ways of conveying all this information. Instead of having the picture with the words written under it or out to the side, the words are incorporated in the picture. That's how we get word balloons. And I don't think anybody would ever think of getting rid of the word balloon. It's the most elegant thing we have in comics. There's a little tail that tells you who's speaking. It represents something that you would hear in a purely visual way, which are what comics do. They're purely visual. Now, the thing is, you see a lot of people getting away from that briefly. They experiment with it. You see creators like Kyle Baker, or Paul Grist, or Frank Miller, or Brian Bendis. They'll do the pictures with the lines out to the side, or they'll do the pictures with the lines underneath, especially when they're representing television. But nobody ever fully gets rid of the word balloon. The thought bubble, on the other hand, is almost completely gone, especially in modern superhero comics, which is weird because they're kind of the same thing. The only difference between a word balloon and a thought bubble is that they round off the edges and chop up the tail, because we all agree that that's what thoughts look like, right? They're in little clouds around your head. That's what thoughts look like? Yeah, of course it is. Well, why did I even ask? Now, I don't know why everyone chooses to avoid thought bubbles these days, but I have a theory. And as usual, it goes back to these two guys. That's right, everybody. It's time for another installment of 1986, the year great comics ruined everything. Let's start with Watchmen. Now, Watchmen is arguably the most influential comic of all time, at least in mainstream superheroics. You have your Action Comics #1s, obviously, Fantastic Four #1, Amazing Spider-Man. All that stuff is really influential, but Watchmen had this weird immediate effect, like right after it came out. Even before it was over, people were already trying to emulate it. And what they picked up on was that Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons use a lot of interesting narrative tricks in this. There's a lot of trickery going on in Watchmen. There's the text pieces in the back that sort of fill out the background and flesh out the world. There's the 9-panel grid that changes the way the story's told by how much information is on each page. They do Watchmen #5, which is one of my favorite issues of all time, because it's laid out symmetrically around the center spread of Ozymandias getting attacked. But they also do something that I don't think a lot of people notice the first time they read it. I certainly didn't, so maybe it's just me. There's no sound effects in Watchmen. There's no sound effects, there's no thought bubbles, there's no location captions. The only words that are on the page are spoken dialogue, until you get to the back matter. But as far as what's in the comic, it's all spoken dialogue and pictures, which is a very lean representation of comics. There are some captions. You get them in the Dr. Manhattan parts a lot, but it's what would be voiceover if it was in a movie. It's being spoken at the time, spoken out loud. You don't get a window into what anybody's thinking, except through their actions and words. And part of that's because it's a mystery. If you knew what Ozymandias was thinking the whole time, then you'd know that he's the guy responsible for everything. Spoiler warning for this 30-year-old comic that everyone has read and they made a movie out of. Sorry. But the only things that you see are what's being spoken out loud. You see the pictures, you hear the dialogue. That's all you get out of Watchmen. And that's part of the effect. That's part of why it works so well. It's an interesting narrative trick. But it's also something that people picked up on and wanted to copy. Like I said, Watchmen's immediately influential. It changes things immediately. If you go back to 1986, 1987, you can actually see people trying to use the 9-panel grid a lot even. But here's the trick about the 9-panel grid. It's really hard for an artist to draw that much on a page, especially if he's doing a monthly book. So they pick up on other ways to emulate Watchmen. Some of it goes with content, some of it goes with the preference for morally ambiguous heroes, people who are morally compromised, the sort of acknowledgement of all the fetish stuff, everything else that ruined comics over the past 30 years, it's all in here. But one of the things they do is they kind of eliminate thought bubbles. It happens almost instantly. There's a sort of slow fade out in a lot of books, but in mainstream superhero comics, they go away pretty quick after this. Now, the other part of that is from this guy. I talked earlier about how Frank Miller experimented with getting rid of captions, or word balloons. And you can see it in panels like that, where you just get the TV screen and then what's going on above it. But one of the things that Dark Knight Returns did that I think was hugely influential, besides everything that Dark Knight Returns did, was that it eliminated thought balloons in favor of narrative captions. Miller and Mazzucchelli do it in Batman Year One, too. And in Batman Year One, they come across the trick of giving everybody their own font. Jim Gordon writes in his notebook, so it's all lowercase letters on a notebook background. Batman's writing in his secret Lisa Frank journal, or whatever Batman has, so it's all written in cursive. But there's narrative captions that are first-person narrative captions that are accompanying people's actions and describing what they're thinking when they're doing them. They're thought bubbles. They're the same thing. All they did was sort of round off those edges and get rid of the tail. They just changed them into narrative captions. Now, the trick to that is that narrative captions are a little more versatile than thought bubbles. Thought bubbles are like word balloons. They sort of have to be in the space around the person who's thinking or speaking. Narrative captions can be contrasted with the art. They can be in a panel where the character who's thinking about it doesn't appear. They function in the same way that a first-person narration in a novel would function, which is an interesting change for comics. It brings them more in line with other media. And sorry to say, superhero comics have always had this kind of inferiority complex when they're compared to other media. You see people trying to do the widescreen cinema-style stuff. You see people stuttering when they try to explain these things. Look, it happens. But the trick is, and I should probably change the name of this episode to The Trick Is instead of Here's the Thing. So here's the thing. Narrative captions work so well that they made the thought bubble extinct. They got rid of it. Because why would you use a thought bubble when you could use something that looks cooler, that fits on the page in a more narrow space, it doesn't take up as much real estate from the art? And it's something that'll remind people of Batman Year One and Dark Knight Returns, which is always a plus. So that's how you get the narrative captions. Now, the narrative captions have their own problems. They're way overused in comics. Think about those issues of Superman Batman, the ones that Jeff Loeb and Ed McGuinness did, where you have the Batman narration and the Superman narration, and they're contrasting with each other. And you get stuff like, Bruce likes pancakes. Clark likes waffles. He'll never understand breakfast. He'll never understand breakfast. It gets silly. But it's less silly than it would be if it was in thought bubbles, in which case it would be taking over the entirety of the page with the different tales leading everybody's head. It would get really confusing. So you get narrative captions, and they're a little more useful. But that's kind of how comics evolve. Stuff that doesn't work, or stuff that gives way to something that works better, is always replaced in favor of getting more information across and allowing for more complex storytelling. That doesn't always mean that it gets to more complex storytelling. And in a lot of ways, losing thought bubbles loses the idea that these superheroes are thinking about stuff. A friend of mine always wanted to do a Superman story that opens with Superman faced with one of those classic problems from the Silver Age, like something that he would have to think his way out of, something that he couldn't just grab and throw into the sun or punch out. And he wanted him to have a thought bubble coming up that says, I feel like I haven't really thought about things for the past 20 years, but now I'm really going to get introspective about it. And I always thought that was a good idea. But until then, I think we're just going to have to deal with narrative captions. Sorry, I like thought bubbles too. But that's what happened to them. Now, if you'd like to ask a question about something that happened in comics, whether it was something that was replaced or something that got changed around to something different, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. I'm at the ISB. And of course, you can always leave a comment on comicsalliance.com whenever Here's the Thing goes up every week. Thanks once again to Stalwart1000 for this week's question. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.